I've never understood the critical acclaim of the Metroid Prime trilogy. Each game's gorgeous presentation and flawless performance are in stark contrast to their rather mundane gameplay and level design, unlike the mainline 2D Metroids that I find much more engaging. Sadly, the long-awaited Metroid Prime 4 is the culmination of all these same problems, even more so than the already mediocre Prime 3. Where Dread elevated the main series by introducing new ideas and greatly expanding on old ones, Prime 4 doubles down on the worst parts of the prior trilogy, and its handful of new inclusions are downright atrocious. This isn't a case where a game with lofty ambitions bit off more than it could chew. Prime 4 feels exceptionally safe and unambitious, masked only by its wonderful art direction. The shockingly low lows may be the most identifiable talking points to hold against this game, but in reality, it's the far more numerous stretches of uninteresting downtime that sour the whole experience. It's just boring. Even before the game completely plateaus in quality during the later sections, I was mindlessly progressing forwards, constantly waiting for the journey to begin in earnest, but it never did. Unfortunately, this continues a theme across my recent videos, when a series changes not by thoughtfully including new and different elements, but by simply removing systems from past games and not replacing them with anything of equal value. Change is not value neutral. Prime 4 isn't disappointing merely for being slightly different. I'd argue it's not different enough. The issue is that the differences that do exist have regressed the game design, leaving a passive experience lacking any meaningful gameplay decisions. These 3D spin-offs have always been more restrictive than games like Super Metroid or Zero Mission, but Prime 4 is the most blatant. Each region of the map is entirely separate with only one entrance point, and the design within all of these spaces is extremely straightforward. Without the interconnected maze-like world Metroid has always been known for, the vestigial interactive map could be removed with minimal repercussions. Even if progression ultimately requires a linear series of upgrades, it's important for that path forward to feel non-linear. If there aren't any wrong ways to go, there's nothing left for the player to discover on their own terms, or any room for divergence between playthroughs. Prime 4 clearly wants to sell the illusion of a non-linear world, but without putting in any of the necessary steps to achieve it. That certainly feels wrong for Metroid, but it wouldn't inherently be a problem if the player was engaged in some other way, except that's not the case here either. Ice Belt is widely remembered for the wonderful moment of reactivating the generator and witnessing the facility spring back to life, but the gameplay leading up to that moment is so hollow. Walking around rooms and scanning everything, with no hazards or obstacles to keep the player stimulated. There's already a precedent in these games for overly long cinematics to convey information that players could easily have seen for themselves, which completely ruins the reveal of the reawakened Grievers from stasis. With the power restored, players are likely somewhat nervous when walking past these cryopods again. But despite this being a linear corridor with several pods already in view, the game feels the need to abruptly remove player control for this moment, instantly deflating the tension. Ridley's appearance on Norian in Prime 3 is memorable purely because it occurs in-game without interruptions. The tedious, drawn-out boss battles of these games have never been a highlight, with so many long stretches of downtime devoid of player agency, and Prime 4 is not much of an improvement. Even when the weak points are finally vulnerable, there isn't much to think about outside of holding down the lock-on button and spamming projectiles. Backtracking was always exhausting in the Prime games, thanks to the slow movement speed, linear corridors, and nerfed traversal mechanics, but this gated world design with a vast, empty desert in between greatly magnifies the problem. Where 2D Metroid weaves players throughout old areas as they venture towards new ones, organically allowing for the collection of new abilities without breaking the pace, Prime 4 slams the brakes with arbitrary detours to previously explored locales for a single upgrade. Some item pickups are locked behind one ability, but only after using it do they reveal they require another second ability to get the reward, likely wasting the player's time by making them backtrack again later in their playthrough. Beam upgrades are even worse. Picking them up in the world isn't enough. Samus has to trek all the way back to base camp and have the upgrade installed in a worthless cutscene by her new best friend. The new Viola motorcycle is a solution to a problem that doesn't need to exist, doubly so when you consider that the speed booster could have been a more versatile, less restrictive inclusion instead. There's no improvement by spreading the key areas so far apart from each other. Each one requires multiple loading zones to access anyway, making this entire system much less efficient than the already pace-breaking planet selection menu in Prime 3. What should, hypothetically speaking, foster a less rigid, more open experience for the player is instead just another linear obstacle with no valuable gameplay. If the desert hadn't wasted enough of the player's time already, the mandatory endgame hunt surely will, ensuring players spend several hours touring the desert to gather green energy crystals. By the end of my second playthrough for capturing footage, this gauge wasn't even at the halfway point, despite me actively running into crystals along the way to each major area and collecting more from the underground shrines. The Chozo artifacts and other collectible quests in the prior games were always a low point, but they required the player to follow clues and form a navigational plan through the map. With some foresight, they could be obtained organically during one's playthrough to avoid any later backtracking. Collecting crystals in Prime 4, however, is totally mindless padding, in a sub-series already loaded with filler. It's no wonder these games hide their unlockables behind the player's percentage of collected items, instead of how quickly they were able to reach the end. In spite of this game's psychic theming, there aren't any functionally different power-ups to obtain outside of this slow, monotonous psychic beam, which I only ever used when explicitly required. It's not worth counting the psychic glove as anything more than an inefficient menu for opening doors. Just another thoughtless way to slow players down. Samus ends this game almost the same way she starts it. The only difference is the type of projectile firing from her arm cannon. It's not just the lock and key philosophy behind Prime's items that I find frustrating. It's the lack of any kind of skill required to use them. The speed booster in Dread is needed to break specific signposted blocks to open crucial paths, but it's also used for platforming challenges that reward the player with new items or shortcuts through the world. The best Metroid games don't merely tell players to use the power, they're expected to use it well. Metroid Prime's abilities have never afforded this kind of utility. The skill ceiling is the same height as the skill floor, heavily discouraging sequence breaking. Players don't earn their upgraded suit through a boss, puzzle, or platforming challenge. They wander all the way back into Vault Forge, use the boost ball on this spinner device, press a button to obtain the new suit, and have to refight a tedious mini-boss on their way out of the area. That's it. The improvements on existing powers that do exist are rather microscopic, but it's only fair that I acknowledge them. Frozen enemies now drop to the floor and take damage on impact. There are grapple beam points on the sides of walls that allow the player to look and shoot before jumping down. The lock-on dash can now move forwards or backwards. And the spider ball can fling Samus off these context-sensitive energy balls in the environment. Outside of that, everything here functions near identically to Metroid Prime 1. There's no intrigue or mystery about the power-ups when everything is the same, and when it blatantly spells out that you're missing an ability. These uninteresting gameplay mechanics are particularly disappointing to me, as I've made all these same complaints before, like in this almost 7-year-old video from 2019, yet Prime 4 made no attempts to improve. I can only speak from my own, more hardcore perspective, but surely casual players would struggle to argue that the game would somehow be worse if these keys had additional practicality. It's not 2002 anymore. There are plenty of first-person games designed for controllers that have more engaging systems than these games do. Outer Wilds has more compelling traversal, and it's a game about walking and reading. But where that game uses its translator tool to assist its expertly crafted narrative directly related to the player, Metroid Prime's scan visor is, at the worst of times, merely a crutch to explain poorly conveyed mechanics. Show, don't tell. I'd have less of an issue with this if scanning wasn't frequently mandatory for progression and tied to the player's completion rating, implying an optimal, intended playthrough requires even more padding to read monotonous flavor text. Including lore is harmless, but it's not the same as telling a story. Prime 4 overloads the player with scannable objects of little value, making it another feature that seems to exist solely because it was in the other games, and not because it would improve the experience in any way. The item symbol blocks from 2D Metroid are certainly less immersive, but they served their purpose much more efficiently than this time-wasting alternative. In an unavoidable retread of what I've already said for the 3D Sonic games, 3D Metroid should take more cues from its superior 2D roots, but it can't evolve only through copying the originals. It needs to consider what unique elements would better suit its first-person 3D perspective. The visors of past games were certainly an attempt at this, although they were quite useless, but Prime 4 neglected these entirely. Platforming certainly isn't impossible in 3D, but the omnipotent, typically orthographic camera of 2D removes any uncertainty over the character's position. 3D first-person games excel with more minute, precise interactions between the player and other objects in the world. If Prime won't adapt the snappy wall jumps and shine sparks of 2D Metroid, I'd happily trade that for the complex problem-solving of immersive sims. Arcane Studios' Prey is essentially a first-person Metroid already, where players navigate a believable, non-linear, interconnected space station overrun by hostile aliens, while earning practical tools to overcome obstacles. It even has its own equivalent of the scan visor. The glue cannon is great for dealing with hazards, but can also create climbable platforms on walls. Most importantly for this comparison, Prey has psychic alien powers that are actually useful, like telekinesis, kinetic blasts of energy, levitation fields, and shape-shifting. None of these tools have a prescribed purpose. They're all left in the player's hands to use or ignore however they please. In a time where 3D Zelda takes off the training wheels and allows Link to rewind time on custom-built physics objects, not unlike an immersive sim, 3D Metroid's lack of modular techniques feels shameful. Metroid shouldn't become a sprawling open world with no limitations or restrictions, but it shouldn't be this dull and formulaic either. There needs to be freedom within constraints. Limits placed on the player that can only be broken through skill. Creative, improvised solutions won't manifest if the simple, cheaper option is too easily accessible. I don't think it can even be counted as problem solving when every problem has the same simple solution, almost like a QuickTime event. Instead of approaching a situation with the closed, binary question of, can I do this, depending on if the player has acquired a certain key item beforehand, Metroid should be fostering more open-ended questions like, how can I do this? By using that item in more complex ways that introduce the possibility of failure. Risk and reward are the foundation of game design. I've said things like this across multiple videos before, but it evidently needs repeating. There's no reason to dwell on Prime 4's underwhelming story that tries and fails to endear players to a new alien race and group of obnoxious Federation troopers, but it might prove useful to dispel a commonly cited defense of these pointless characters, in the hopes of better understanding the aesthetic appeal of Metroid. Companions such as this, and others from Prime 3 who I found similarly questionable, are often said to quote, make sense within the fiction of the world, because annoying people like this exist within real life. And they aren't, quote, that bad. Ignoring the fact that this is basically saying the characters are bad on purpose, realism or logic do not justify a bad decision that is tonally out of place with the appeal of an artistic work. Nobody doubted that normal people existed within the Metroid universe, but that doesn't mean they asked to see and hear from them, as it directly opposes the player's sense of verisimilitude and personal discovery. This is fiction. Every component is a conscious artistic decision that gets carried through the full development pipeline. If it's not fun to babysit a bunch of unlikable sidekicks, then don't include them. Dread incorporated voiced dialogue much more elegantly, with brief conversations from more stoic, alien characters that better fit the dark tone. Fusion acknowledged that while Samus may occasionally watch over a team for specific missions, we don't need to dwell on it in gameplay. I quite pointedly dislike the prominence of the Federation in Prime 3, but those characters were straight-faced and professional, and Prime 2's soldiers had the decency to die before Samus arrived, serving their function as more thematically appropriate set dressing. Logically, it would also make sense for Samus to perform mundane repairs for her suit and gunship, fill out paperwork for her contracts with the Galactic Federation, and take occasional breaks to use the bathroom. But we don't see any of that because it doesn't matter. It would be absurd for doors in real life to be opened by gunfire, but that's how they operate in Metroid because it serves the gameplay. The motion-controlled buttons and keypads of Prime 3 may seem slightly more believable in-universe, but completely break the pace of the game. They have no reason to exist from a design perspective. Besides, let's not pretend that unnecessary dialogue is solely a criticism of Metroid. It can be an annoyance in any game. But its inclusion in a franchise renowned for its moody atmosphere is especially baffling. There are less intrusive, optional methods of making these games more accessible that don't need to drag the experience down for everyone else. But each Prime game has drifted further away from this philosophy over time. If our metric for quality is based solely on some arbitrary sense of realism, then it should be considered a major failure that these archetypical nobodies would be telling Samus what to do at all. For them to truly view her as this distant, powerful hero, they should have the confidence to let Samus figure things out on her own. If we're meant to find these squad mates endearing, perhaps it would also make sense for that to be reflected within the player character. But Samus hardly emotes and never even speaks. This was fine during her prior solitary adventures, but placing an emotionless Samus in this talkative team dynamic only further accentuates what a misguided decision this was. Her eyes aren't even visible through the visor anymore, when this has been standard issue since the very first Prime. It's also not very believable that some of these people don't take their situation seriously, making irritating one-liners and spelling out their personalities in the most childish, unsubtle ways possible. Armstrong could have been shy and reserved around Samus to mask how much she idolizes her, but instead expounds this immediately, as if the audience are incapable of interpreting subtext. Samus uncharacteristically abandons all of these troops to be slaughtered off-screen by Psylux anyway, which implies a lack of confidence in this story's reception from the writing staff. Leave their fates vague enough, and they can be easily forgotten and assumed dead, or dramatically return for sequels, when Miles McKenzie becomes the next fan favorite destined to join Smash Bros. I never cared for the cheesy bounty hunters in Prime 3, but that game had the common sense to give each one a definitive end. Players aren't drawn to Metroid for the dated, annoying direction of other AAA titles. They want the unique features that make Metroid distinct. We play Metroid to be Samus. not see her surrounded by self-insert sycophants. These narratives work best when they play to their strengths, through subtlety and mood, not loud, in-your-face trends seen elsewhere. Ultimately, Prime 4 fails to engage me as a player, and I'd like to visualize this more clearly. A game needs to afford a certain degree of complexity across one or more of its systems to meet a minimum threshold of player engagement. Think of this as the engagement floor and engagement ceiling. Everyone will have a different tolerance for how much or how little a game can demand from them. This isn't just about making a game hard, but forcing the player to make decisions and play less passively. For example, action games can lean heavily into combat and traversal through linear spaces to reach the engagement floor, without needing to overload the player and hit their engagement ceiling with other considerations, like remembering where to go next or solving difficult puzzles. For Metroid specifically, I would strongly argue that its three core pillars are exploration, combat, and platforming. Not as separate elements in their own bespoke portions of gameplay, but constant systems complementing each other simultaneously. The player has to platform in order to navigate the environment, but also to engage with enemies, dodging around them or jumping straight into them with the same tools used for traversal. Ice-based weapons are effective for dispatching enemies, but also for turning them into platforms to further explore the map. Using Dread as an example, it provides a solid amount of engagement across all three pillars, creating a game greater than the sum of its parts. The exploration isn't immediately as freeform as I'd like, but sequence breaking makes up for it with a whole new level of problem solving in order to navigate certain areas. Bosses and standard enemies are faster and more demanding than ever, and Samus feels great to control, with plenty of opportunities to use her new abilities for efficient traversal. None of the Prime games fare quite as strongly here. The details vary between each entry, but exploration is generally much more guided, though some thoughtful pathfinding is still required to make worthwhile progress, so it gets a pass. The combat, however, is very weak, and the games are nearly devoid of locomotion beyond walking and jumping. Items like the grapple beam are far too situational and automated to be relevant under these criteria. Prime 4 inherits all of these same qualities, except with vastly limited exploration without anything to supplement its absence. Combat and platforming remain unchanged, so all that's left are the visuals and music, with nothing of mechanical value. In other words, where the earlier Prime games were at least capable of reaching my personal engagement floor, Prime 4 does not. The most complex moments of the entire game involved timing morph ball bombs during this robot Silksong boss battle, and performing one singular mid-air bomb jump to reach an energy tank in an optional shrine. It may not be a terrible game, but it's a very boring one. Forgive me for the dramatic statement, but I think it's reasonable to declare Metroid Prime 4 as a Metroid game in name only, featuring the most superficial illusions of what defines the series without delivering where it matters most, and refusing to improve upon an already underdeveloped foundation. Its new features are so genuinely dumbfounding that they come off like a silk post, a genre of ironic, intentionally misleading jokes depicting fake aspects of Hollow Knight Silksong pre-release that would be widely criticized if they were real. Imagine if soon after its 2017 announcement, it was stated that Prime 4 would be excessively linear and hand-holding, with a big empty desert featuring underground shrines from Breath of the Wild, a 10-minute unskippable motorbike tutorial, hours-long grindy crystal quest, and quippy side characters who tag along to fight waves of the same enemies. It sounds like parody, but it is a natural extension of the already contentious Prime 3, and the poorly calculated Federation Force. Cutting out these haphazard additions would make Prime 4 less bad, but it wouldn't make it more good when the core formula remains this basic. The valleys would be gone, but this is a game without any peaks either, leaving only a lifeless flat line of quality. To dismiss this negative reaction towards Prime 4 as merely entitled fans with lofty expectations after years of build-up would be to ignore any nuance or reason as to why they feel that way. It also overlooks the fact that Fusion and the once mythical Metroid Dread had a similar, almost 2 decades long duration between releases as Primes 3 and 4. Yet you'd struggle to find Dread receiving the same vocal backlash. It wouldn't be entirely fair to ignore Zero Mission and Samus Returns in this comparison, despite their status as remakes, but that's still a huge 13-year difference. Released only 6 weeks before Metroid Prime 4, the comparably long-awaited return of 3D Ninja Gaiden is my perfect example of evolving a previously stale series. Just like Prime, I felt the earlier games had a lot of problems, but the series triumphantly re-emerged with major fundamental improvements alongside fresh, new ideas, completely surpassing the originals and becoming one of my favorite games of the year. It's not flawless, but it maintained and accentuated the good aspects of Ninja Gaiden while almost entirely removing the bad, and single-handedly restored my faith in Platinum Games after their disappointing recent titles and loss of key staff. I need to make a harsh but clear distinction between the Prime sub-series and the real Metroid games. Metroid Prime 4 is not Metroid 4, as I so often hear repeated from onlookers. Metroid Fusion is Metroid 4. Even after Dread's success, Prime continues to overshadow the 2D titles in wider conversation, from what I have to assume is a collective Western bias towards first-person 3D games over two-dimensional side-scrollers. I have an undeniable respect for the Prime games, mostly for their outstanding art direction, but they've always felt like a tolerable side dish to the far greater main course. I would prefer that 2 distinct approaches to Metroid can coexist if they were equally enjoyable, but as it stands, these 3D titles consistently fail to meet those standards. Mimicking the far worse 3D Sonic series, the original Prime stands as the closest these games have ever been to their 2D roots, only drifting further and further away upon each new entry. Had Other M not been a total disaster, it may have fostered a new breed of 3D Metroid with the speed and agility I've long dreamed of. Although I would have expected similar influence from the highly regarded Doom and Titanfall games as well, but Prime 4 shows no signs of such inspiration. Or perhaps, if Prey was more successful in 2017, Retro Studios and the higher-ups at Nintendo may have determined that it was viable to include more logical problem-solving and dense intertwining level design. It's rather ironic that the stagnant gameplay of the Prime series mirrors their placement in the wider Metroid timeline, narratively trapped between Metroid 1 and 2 as to avoid disrupting any later continuity. Prime 4 supposedly subverts this by taking place after Super Metroid, but you wouldn't know that by playing it, since, much like its tired gameplay, it was intentionally designed to leave the status quo undisturbed. 3D Metroid has so much untapped potential. There are glimpses of it all throughout the medium today, but usually in isolated chunks spread across different genres. If the stars align, a chosen one from a distant world may bless this cursed land, gathering all the pieces together and leaving all the baggage behind, finally bringing 3D Metroid into its prime.